You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Gail and Clavy are joining you once again. It is Mother's Day, the 12th of May of 2024. It's good to be joining you folks once again. Took a little bit of an unplanned but welcome hiatus from the podcast, but we're back and looking forward to bringing you some talk, some news, some commentary on what's going on with IU athletics and beyond. And hopefully you're all having a good spring. Things have moved along nicely for Indiana in a variety of different areas. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. We'll talk about some IU basketball items, some IU football items, some other things going on. So looking forward to doing all that with you folks. First of all, just a friendly reminder that CrimsonCast is part of the Back Home Network, where you can find a plethora of shows focused specifically on the things you love the most in IU athletics, whether that is our friends at Assembly Call, breaking down everything that happens with IU basketball, whether that's Tony Adrania's Film Room, whether that's X's and Joe's with Bob and Mike, whether that, I mean, there's so many different avenues you can go down with the Back Home Network. Be sure to go to the Back Home Network YouTube channel, join the over 6,000 subscribers that have joined us there, and be sure to join us on Substack as well. All of us brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashion, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, all kinds of amazing things happening right now with Home Field that don't directly relate to Indiana University, but that you should be taking advantage of. I was really excited yesterday. I posted about it on my Instagram. I got my Indy 500 order. You can see, for those of you who are watching the video on YouTube, this is my 1985 commemorative trucker hat. This thing is so badass, I can barely put it into words. And this was part of that recent drop. I got a Snake Pit t-shirt, which was also baller. Just a really, really amazing array of things. They just dropped an Arrow McLaren collection that you can take advantage of as well. And of course, all of the different college apparel items that are available to you. You should go check those out at homefieldapparel.com. Use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. Again, HOME23 at homefieldapparel.com. And of course, you know, if you like the Bison, I've got the Bison t-shirt on here as well. Also, a reminder on the Substack front, crimsoncast.substack.com. Join us. It's free. You get emails sent directly to you with podcast links. We'll have some show notes, I think, moving forward. VIP videos, we've been a little bit light on those lately. The VIP videos, for those of you who have decided you want to financially support the podcast, which we always greatly appreciate, it's a reasonable price, $5 a month, $50 a year, helps to make everything possible. So join us on Substack. We would love to have you. Anyway, a lot to talk about. And I wanted to go ahead and dive in and maybe just kind of start things off by talking a little football, and then we're going to get to IU basketball. First of all, congratulations to IU softball, who overcame what was a bit of a disappointing regular season and got all the way to the Big Ten title game. Ended up losing to Michigan yesterday in that, but a tremendous performance by Shonda Stanton and the ladies. And we'll see what happens with the NCAA tournament draw. Maybe that was enough to get them in. Also, IU baseball, right on the borderline, had a chance, extra innings at Nebraska yesterday, and then gave up a 2-run homer in the bottom of the 10th. But right there at the top of the Big Ten, they've been playing as well as anybody. And still, kind of in the mix for a regular season Big Ten title, which is amazing given where that team started and the struggles they had in March. So hopefully IU can pull it together and win these last 4 or 5 games and head into the Big Ten tournament on a strong note. Basketball, speaking of strong notes, it's been, as I said, a while since I was on the microphone, and a lot has happened with IU basketball in terms of signings, to the point that, frankly, like a lot of the concerns that we shared in March and February regarding this team, at least on paper, look like they've been addressed. And I think that the coaching staff deserves a tremendous amount of credit for that. You know, when you think about where this team has been at and what the problems really were, and what we really tried to talk about over the course of the the end of the season and kind of the struggles that Indiana was having, a lot of it really surrounded this idea of there's clearly some issues with the way that IU has been constructed roster-wise as far as the 23-24 roster is concerned. How do they address that going into 24-25? And a lot of it was, well, they're going to have to retain the players that they've got, that they want, that are planning on coming back. You knew Khalil Ware was probably not coming back, but how many of the remaining players would stick around? It seemed like an open question. And then who can they pull in the portal, given the struggles that they had outside of the center position in the portal last year? Well, you look at what Indiana's done, and if those were the first two tests, retaining and then attracting the right kind of talent, they really look like they've passed both of those with flying colors. We've seen a lot of people talking about this IU roster specifically as being among the best in terms of how it was augmented over the course of this non-conference, or the out of season, not the non-conference. The non-conference is later. But if we look at Bart Torvik's website, which I always highly recommend, Torvik is kind of like Ken Palm, but it's free. And the calculations I oftentimes think are a little bit better than Ken Palm in terms of trying to figure out exactly what's going on analytically in college basketball. He's got this thing on his website now, which is college basketball projections for next year based upon roster data. And what you find is that if you scroll down, the top teams right now in terms of where their rosters are at, it's Houston, Iowa State, Kansas, Gonzaga, and Duke. All of those make some sense. Duke may be a little bit high given what they lost. But Indiana, who, of course, as you'll recall, finished the season in the 70s or 80s in Torvik, is up to 21st. And you can see here on the screen, projected to be the 29th best offense, 27th best defense. And, if you look at what they've got returning, they've got about 59% of their, or about 60% of their minutes returning. They've got quite a bit of talent returning overall, and they were able to pull in players that look like they're going to have a positive impact on what they're doing. And in fact, let me switch to another screen real quick. And what you'll see here is what is called the roster cast. And what it does is it basically goes through and looks at what the individual players that are on the roster now might be able to contribute. And, as you might expect, Malik Renew kind of at the top of the heap in terms of total minutes, total usage, offensive rating projected at 113, which would be awesome. But then number 2, Miles Rice, who, of course, Indiana's brought in, as one of its guards for this upcoming year. Trey Galloway up near the top, Mackenzie Mbako, then Omar Ballo, Kanan Carlisle. Just right down the list. Like, what you see with this team is a team that looks like it's going to be able to get contributions from a variety of different people offensively, because that's really what this is grading. And this doesn't even really fully count, does Gabe Cupps take a leap from a talent execution perspective during this offseason? Do we see Ja'Kai Newton come back from his injury and look good? Can Anthony Leal produce and contribute more than he did last year? And obviously he contributed a decent amount last year, all things considered. It's a really solid roster. And as I said earlier, I think a lot of the concerns that we expressed here, that I expressed about where this was at, a lot of it was predicated on this idea that really we hadn't seen this coaching staff be able to fully restock the cupboard through the portal or through, grabbing a player like Bryson Tucker, doing all of that combined. Yes, I know they certainly were able to grab Mackenzie Mbako last year, but it was an incomplete roster is my point. This looks like a pretty complete roster. It's probably a need for another backup big, but that's about it. There's really not much work left to do, and we've even heard some rumors about the big from Bellarmine perhaps coming in. So all of this is good. And I think what's going to be fascinating now with IU basketball as we move forward is how does all of this mesh? And this is the one thing where when we see people kind of being critical on social media and saying, I'm still kind of out on this team or this roster or this coaching staff, I think so much of it comes back to the loss of trust that I think a lot of people feel after how poorly a lot of this last season went. And it's one of those things where you kind of have to see a change and you have to see things work differently than they did for people to really get back with it again. And, it's unfortunate, but it's also just kind of a reality of things that when you get down to it, this fan base just feels like that it's been burned a bunch of times. And it's hard once you lose that trust to get it back. We've seen it with the last few coaches. But, certainly if you're looking at the pieces on paper right now, it's hard to argue against the idea that this coaching staff did essentially everything that you would have wanted them to do in the offseason. Now the question is, how does that come together as far as the regular season roster and the performance is concerned? And, so much of the attention has been on the offense. It's been interesting watching the debate back and forth about whether or not this team was going to pull in another big, or if they needed to pull in another wing player or what have you. It feels to me like, right now you're kind of at a limit where you're not going to be able to play all the guys that you've currently got the minutes that they're going to want. So I do look at it right now and saying you're almost hurting yourself if you're going and trying to pull in more players, because when are they going to get minutes? We just heard John Calipari, as he's putting together his Arkansas roster, say he's going to play 8 guys total. And that's about where Indiana's at. And that's essentially kind of what they did this past year, or I think what they would have wanted to do down the stretch, if not for injury and if not for some of the struggles that they had. This team, if they stick with what they're going with on the roster right now, looks like they're going to play a little smaller. Looks like they're going to be in a situation where, that you might get Mackenzie Mbako at the 4. You might get some flexibility in terms of the lineup. You might get Trey Galloway playing as part of a 3-guard lineup. There's a bunch of different directions that this team can go. And there's a lot of unknowns. I mean, we mentioned it earlier. We don't know how ready Bryson Tucker is going to be for the big time. Certainly looks like a very talented player, and he kind of fits right in the middle in terms of the height and overall physical build of this team. We don't know how Ja'Kai Newton's going to look. We don't know how Gabe Cupps is going to improve from that first year. We don't know how Trey Galloway is going to look post-surgery. Obviously, he had to get some work done to get his body back and right. But if Indiana is indeed going to go a little bit smaller in terms of how they're playing offensively, that's a big step. And now you've got players that can create. You've brought in a 3-point shooter in Luke Goody. You've got Mackenzie Mbako, who really came on. So there's a lot of intriguing pieces here. And, there's kind of 2 competing theories about the offense from last year. But one of the theories that I think a lot of people have been putting forward is this idea that it wasn't so much the lack of outside shooting as it was the lack of playmaking consistently that created all of the other issues that led to Indiana having to consistently send it into the post and then try to distribute from there. And then, of course, down the stretch of the season, Trey Galloway having to essentially be like a non-point guard creator, which led to all of those assist numbers that he had. And, clearly Indiana figured something out offensively at the end of the season that allowed them to win the games that they won. But if Indiana, with a little more roster flexibility and a little bit more playmaking at the guard position, can stretch things out a little bit, you add in the rim protection that Ballo provides. I mean, it's a really intriguing roster. And offensively, you look at it and it's like, well, how would you feel about Indiana if they were a top 30 offense? I mean, last year in KenPom, at least, Indiana finished 105th offensively, which was just not good enough. And if you look at the overall ranking of the Big Ten teams last year in terms of offensive efficiency, there were only 2 teams worse than Indiana in offensive efficiency last year. One of them was Rutgers, and the other one was Maryland. And those teams were both teams that finished 7-13 in the conference. So Indiana clearly has to take a step forward there. Where I continue to bang the drum is I'm really fascinated by what does Indiana do defensively? How does Indiana improve defensively? That has been the biggest concern I've had in terms of trend line. Indiana in 3 years has gone in terms of defensive efficiency, so how good they are at stopping the opposing team from scoring. They've gone from 24th in Mike Woodson's first year to 45th in his second year to 84th in his third. And the one thing that I think was concerning, I mean, you can attribute a bunch of different issues to the offensive problems that Indiana was having last year. And I don't know that anybody could say for sure what specifically the problem was. But the defense really did concern because, with the rim protection Indiana had, yes, they were lacking athleticism on the perimeter. They still should have been better defensively than they were. To be 84th in the country in defensive efficiency is just not really going to get the job done. And if you look at the Big Ten, there were only 3 teams that were worse than them defensively. Iowa, who's always terrible defensively, Michigan, who really didn't look like they cared, and Minnesota, who seems to be always terrible defensively as well. And there were other teams that were in the mix. I mean, Illinois got by last year being hyper efficient on offense and being really mid on defense. They were 80th in the country. Penn State was 81st. So it wasn't like Indiana was entirely alone in that category. But the problem was Indiana couldn't overcome their lack of defensive efficiency with good offense. And that ultimately ended up leading to a lot of the inconsistency that we saw with this team last year. So how well can Indiana and Mike Woodson build a defensive identity and build defense into their team persona, given the fact that they're going to be integrating a bunch of new pieces? That's the one thing that I really do get concerned about. I mean, defense to some degree feels like a product of being able to know what your role is and what the role of your teammates is going to be. And you can, again, I think in this era of basketball especially, you can overcome bad defense with really, really good offense. But you still need to play at least somewhat decent defense unless you're playing like ridiculously good offense. Like last year, there were really 3 teams that fit that paradigm of teams that were insanely good offensively and were not really that great defensively at all. Kentucky being one of them. They got bounced in the first round of the tournament. Alabama, who made it all the way to the Final Four. And then Illinois, who was right on the precipice there. Like each of those teams was top 10 offensively, and they were 80th or worse defensively. I don't think Indiana really wants to live that way, though. And I think, for a coach like Mike Woodson, who obviously played for Bob Knight, understands the defensive identity of Indiana basketball, it feels like that has to be something that gets worked on. And that is probably the thing that I'm most curious about with this roster. How well do they gel defensively, and how effectively can IU set up a system defensively that's going to work? You look at the individual components last year of Indiana defensively and why they weren't as good as they could have been. And to me, it really boils down to 2 things. The lack of forced turnovers. Indiana was 308th in the country in forcing turnovers. And what happens in that case is that you don't get the opposing team to give up the 4 or 5 possessions that you would normally give up, even with just an average level of turnovers forced. So that means more possessions where you get shots. It means more possessions where the shots might go in, which raises your opposing team's offensive efficiency and makes your defensive efficiency worse. The other aspect that was poor for Indiana last year, and this has been kind of a trend with Mike Woodson's teams in general. So I think it's an interesting choice that's being made, but it's in the percentage of offensive rebounds given up to the opponent. The first year that Indiana played under Mike Woodson, they were actually really good in this area. And they had Trace Jackson Davis, Race Thompson. They had Michael Durr coming in off the bench. They really didn't give up very many offensive rebounds at all that year. They were 64th in the country. But then last year, or 2 years ago, I guess, and last year, they were in that 29 to 30% surrendered range, which just really wasn't good enough. And again, for those of you who are still struggling to understand efficiency, when you give up offensive rebounds, you're allowing the opponent to extend the possession. And that creates a problem because if you can extend a possession, chances are you're going to score on it, which lowers your defensive efficiency. So how does Indiana attack that, especially since they're going to be a little smaller next year, we think, in terms of how they play? So I don't have any answers. That's going to be really fascinating. And that's, I think, probably the biggest thing that the coaching staff is going to have to work on. Yes, they need to increase their offensive efficiency. They cannot afford to be 105th in the country. And I think that they will, just by the nature of the players they brought in. But the other question becomes, what does Indiana do defensively? How do they address that? I am fascinated to see what happens with all of that. So we will see. Some other quick items to mention before we move over to football. An interesting story that popped up here over the last couple of days. If you haven't been following, there's a new tournament that's being staged in Las Vegas. It's an NIL tournament. And it's being put on by the same people that put on, like, I think the Charleston Classic or something like that. But what's fascinating to me about this tournament is, like, basically they're giving every team worth of players like $1 million. And then if you win this tournament, you get like $1 million of NIL money. The players are going to be participating in NIL related activities. This is all happening in Las Vegas, and it's happening over Thanksgiving break. And it's just, the whole thing's kind of fascinating because they're calling it the Players Era Festival, and they've got right now 8 teams that have committed, and they're pretty big names: Alabama, Houston, Notre Dame, Oregon, Rutgers, San Diego State, Texas A&M. The big story with all of this is that it was just announced that the 8th team for this tournament this year is Creighton. Creighton was supposed to play in the battle for Atlantis, which is where Indiana's playing in November, but instead they've backed out of that. They're going to have to pay a penalty to get out of the Atlantis tournament, and instead they're going to this tournament in Las Vegas. And to quote this story by Dennis Dodd and Matt Nordlander from CBS Sports, the event will include $1 million NIL payouts for 8 participating schools. What's more, players involved will have future earnings opportunities through long-term NIL contracts. And they're light on details about what all of this means, but it's going to be fascinating because the NIL collective of each participating school, again quoting this story, will be paid $1 million. Additional significant NIL opportunities, believed to be in the neighborhood of another $1 million, will be awarded exclusively to the winner or winners of the event, depending on the final bracket format. They're talking about either one bracket of 8 or 2 brackets of 4. The athletes, while in Las Vegas, will be required to participate in multiple off-the-court activities to earn that NIL money. That quid pro quo agreement for NIL money is a key distinction and at the core of the appeal of the festival. So this has really been a bit of a little seismic event that's happened in college sports, because the multi-team event, the exempt tournament, you all know these, like, you see them all over the place, and these have been, they don't like have huge profit margins, but they're ways for teams to get exposure. They're ways for television to get some games. And so, like, the Maui Classic is one of these, the NIT, preseason NIT, Atlantis is one of them. There's a bunch of different ones. But this one's different in that it's pulling teams away from tournaments that they'd already committed to because of this financial guarantee, because it's an extra $1 million in NIL money. And people are very concerned in college basketball, at least the ones around the traditional MTEs, that this is going to completely upset the apple cart. It's a very disruptive approach, because if you can't give $1 million in NIL money to the participating teams, it's like, why would I participate in a tournament? I don't need the television exposure because that's going to happen anyway at this point. Everybody's on TV. So it's interesting to think what's going to happen with Indiana. Indiana might be one of the few teams that doesn't need the extra NIL money because of how flush IU appears to be with NIL cash. But obviously, if there's $1 million available, the secret about millionaires is when there's $1 million available, they go get the $1 million. They're not like, you know what, I've got $1 million already, I'm fine. It's like, ooh, I could have $2 million. So that's going to be fascinating. It's also going to be fascinating to see if this thing actually goes anywhere, because obviously, if you're not making a lot of profit margins, it's like, what are you getting for your money? And if you're giving away $8 million, $9 million in this tournament to these teams, where's that money coming from? So I'm curious if this is just a disruptor event or if this is something that could really extend into something bigger. And will we see Indiana in one of these at some point soon? Probably. I'm just curious to see what it looks like. We're seeing this whole landscape change, and I need to do a podcast at some point where all we do is focus on the off season or the out of season changes that have happened in college basketball. There's been a ton of them. There was just a ruling the other day, in an emergency ruling, that you can do unlimited visits for transfer portal players now, because teams were trying to ration those, and it was becoming impossible to know who to bring on campus and who not to, with how crazy this whole portal process is. So anyway, I'll get to a podcast on that at some point soon. But just wanted to bring that up that, we thought we had the Atlantis field settled, and apparently we do not now because Creighton's going to Las Vegas instead. Let's jump over and talk about IU football. And the first thing I wanted to note, I'm going to put this up on the screen for those of you that are watching on the YouTube channel. So there's a website called CFB Depth, or College Football Depth, that has been looking at the rosters of the various teams. And I'm going to pop this up here. This kind of took people by surprise because this website, in talking about IU, was like, IU might have a top 5 most talented roster in the whole Big Ten. Which, for those of us who have been watching IU football for a while, it's like, really? That good? So if you look at where Indiana's at right now in the echelon of things, and I've got it popped up now, this website has Indiana ranked 50th overall, 44th in offense, 61st in defense. Team depth of C, which sounds bad and probably is a little bit bad, but if you keep in mind that Indiana's depth oftentimes looks like it's a D or an F, maybe if it's a C, it feels like an improvement. And you look across the board, they get they get an A- in their quarterback starters, a B in depth. They get a B for starters and running backs, a B+ in wide receiving starters. Tight ends are a C+. Offensive line is an A-, although the depth there is a D-, which is a bit of an issue. And then even defensively, an A- now for defensive line, a B+ for linebackers, a B+ for the secondary, and then an 86 overall for specialists. Like, that's all really good. And you compare it to the teams Indiana's going to be playing, and the only teams that are like rated clearly ahead of Indiana on the overall setup here are Ohio State, Washington, Michigan, Maryland, and UCLA. But even that is kind of interesting to think about. Indiana's got the higher ratings than Nebraska, barely, Michigan State, Purdue, FIU, Western Illinois, and Charlotte, and Northwestern. And you also look at a school like UCLA, it's like, whatever the methodology is on this, it seems hard to believe that UCLA's got the 10th best defense in the country coming into the season, but we'll see. Point being, between this and what Indiana's managed to do, landing some pretty highly regarded transfers on the defensive side of things, it's really been fascinating watching this momentum, and people have been paying attention. I mean, Pete Thamel has tweeted multiple times about Indiana football. We've got this account tweeting about IU football. And look, these things don't necessarily mean anything. What matters is what the outcome of the games are. But it's exciting to see that Indiana is being regarded as well as they're being regarded on a national level. And there was a video I was seeing the other day, where there was a gentleman talking about how, Indiana's flipped like 30 to 35 players' spots on their roster, which is, if you think about it, that's 40% of the roster basically that's turned over. And it's been what appear to be quality players coming into to these spots and taking over. And we're going to have to see how all of that equates, much like the basketball conversation we just had. You can do a lot of stuff on paper, but ultimately, if you've been watching IU football for the last few years, you've seen the deficiencies in terms of how the team has played. This season feels like a season where you're still going to have some kinks to work out, but there's a lot better raw materials to work with. And having talked with some folks close to the team over the course of the last month, it's been interesting listening to the reactions to Curt Cignetti and the way that he has approached coaching this roster. And the thing that has stuck out, I think, more than anything else in those conversations that I've had, and these have been people that are close enough that they would know this, like the real difference has been the business-like approach that Cignetti and his coaching staff have taken in terms of what's being done in the weight room, how spring practice went. It's fascinating. You've seen some additional roster turnover from IU post-spring ball, as I think it became clear what the expectations were, whether players wanted or were able to live up to those expectations, but also, what the coaching staff was looking for and how they were going through and trying to evaluate things. And what excites me, I think, more than anything else about where this team is at right now is that there really does appear to be an internal sense of belief in the process that Curt Cignetti has brought to the table, far more so than I think there was with Tom Allen. I think for some of the folks involved, it's been a situation where perhaps they didn't realize that there were steps that they could be taking to improve their overall position that maybe weren't being done. That sounds like a criticism of Tom Allen. It's really meant to be more, if you look at coaching and you look at the way the teams are put together, a lot of the dividing line between teams is really about routine. It's about consistency. It's about what's being focused on, how time is being utilized. And what Curt Cignetti and his staff did at James Madison, did at Elon, and what they appear to be doing here so far is really drilling down on the most important things and focusing on details. And if you've listened to this podcast over time, you know that's something that we've been banging on about for a long time, was the lack of attention to detail in the Tom Allen era. And it could occasionally be games where Indiana's emotion and vibes, as they were, would lead to success, would lead to victories, or at least lead to close games. But there were often games, far more often than not, where Indiana just fell short because their opponent seemed to just have planned things out better, or had practiced the types of things that needed to be practiced more than Indiana had been able to. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, Indiana has done a lot of great work in the portal without overwhelming NIL money, and they've been beating out teams with more NIL money for some of these transfers. And as we talked about, this is why the arguments for Tom Allen just needing more NIL money, I think, always miss the point. NIL money certainly helps, but you got to have a vision. People have to believe that what you're doing is going to get them where they want to go, is going to lead to team success. And that right now is where this Indiana team under Curt Cignetti is flourishing in the offseason. They are clearly attracting players who have already done some really good things at other places. And they're selling them on the idea that this is a place where you can achieve those kinds of things. And here's our system. Here's what we're planning on doing. Here's how you fit into the picture. That is exciting. Will it lead to success? I don't think anybody knows. I've talked about trying to hedge expectations as much as possible for first seasons, but it's clearly resonating with players that wouldn't normally have looked at Indiana. And I think that more than anything else is really exciting. So we'll see what happens. But that is where we're at right now with IU football. And it's a good thing. So we'll keep an eye on that throughout the course of the summer. I wish we had more practices to look at, but I'm sure we'll have some additional information as we move forward. One other item real quick I wanted to touch on before we wrap up. There was an interesting post on the college football Reddit, which the college football Reddit may be the only good Reddit, like subreddit, that there is. Like, most of them are just not very fun or entertaining, but the college football subreddit normally has some really good conversation and some good articles. I'm going to link this post in the Substack that I send out for this article. But there was a gentleman who follows Oregon. I'm assuming it's a gentleman. It might be a lady. But wrote, I maintain my own roster database of each Big Ten team. It appears that Nebraska right now has 98 players that are on scholarship. They list 149 players on their current roster. But it looks like they have 98 players who are listed as being like scholarship athletes. And this guy was like, how could that be the case? Because that you can't have 98 scholarships. It's got to be 85. And they're going to have to cut people or whatever. But someone brought up an interesting point in the comments, which has been a trend that I think a lot of people are keeping an eye on, and it's happened more and more. And it was noted that some programs like Nebraska, Michigan, et cetera, that are over scholarship limit will opt to pay players the cost of tuition and name, image, and likeness as walk-ons rather than actually giving them a scholarship. So, let's say we're at 85 scholarship athletes and we want to bring in another one. It's like, well, we don't have another scholarship to give this person. Oh, that's fine. Well, tuition and cost of attendance is $95,000. We're going to give that player an NIL deal that's worth $95,000. Well, now they're going to college for free for this year. You might say, that's cheating. How can you do that? It's actually not cheating according to the NIL rules, because as long as there's a business contract involved in that NIL deal, you can do that. And a player can choose, and we've seen so much of this with preferred walk-ons. Like if you've seen that terminology thrown around a bunch. Indiana's got people coming in as preferred walk-ons. It just means they're not on scholarship. But in the NIL era, you can basically give them the financial equivalent of a scholarship without it actually being a scholarship, which is a fascinating development. And it's from a competitive perspective, it's not great, obviously, because it is a way to circumvent the scholarship rules that are supposed to keep things relatively even across the board. But it's another indication and another illustration that college sports has got to get its act together and come up with some actual legitimate roster rules to keep these sorts of things from happening. Like, all of this happens because the NCAA refuses to just say, hey, we need employment contracts and we need to set hard limits on what our teams are doing. In their overwhelming and never-ending effort to appear like it's amateur athletics, they continue to allow situations like this to essentially affect what little competitive balance there might be in college sports. All I can say is, again, as I've talked about this, it feels like ad nauseum on the podcast for the last couple of years, college sports just like set some rules that actually can be enforced, especially at the college football and college basketball levels. Between the transfer portal and this new thing that's happening with giving walk-ons NIL money that essentially act as scholarships, you are creating something that is doing far more damage than just paying the athletes would have. And that's, to me, the biggest irony of this whole thing is that, it's ironic that we keep hearing about, paying athletes would lead to like the destruction of college sports. And yet college sports is eating itself right now in an effort to not pay college athletes. It's wild. Anyway, I've gone too long. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. It was great to talk to you folks yet again. We'll be back with more podcasts coming up soon. Lots of stuff going on still in May. Rosters still being settled. We'll see how all that plays out. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Be sure to check out the rest of the Back Home Network, including the new Pacers podcast, Right Up Meridian, starring Scott Caulfield and friends. For all those folks, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.